Hey there, Patreon family! Welcome back to a brand new little bonus lesson. Today is actually pretty exciting because we're going to do something here that we've never done on the channel before. And it's going to be a very pristine, very clean looking fence that's going to add some extra bright values into the painting, that's going to add some structure into the painting, and that's going to continue our leading lines along the path. So, to begin, I'm going to start here with the smaller flat-headed brush. Again, this one is about 1/4 inch. I'm going to make sure that it's a little bit damp, so I just dipped it in water, wiped off the excess, and now I'm going to head to my palette, grab some titanium white, a hint of Mars black, not much at all. We want this to be quite a bright gray. That's actually probably too dark, so we'll take some additional titanium white, just like that. Looks like a good, nice light gray. And now we're going to find where we want our posts here in the painting. And I think I want one right here. So I'll move it up, maybe to there. And you'll know exactly where all of this goes because it'll be included in the traceable. But I'm still trying to figure it out. And I'm just looking at all of my heights here, what will look too big, what will look too small. Starting with something that's a little bit smaller. And then if I feel like I need to make it bigger, I will. But I'm just starting with a single board of white wood right here. And it doesn't need to be perfect in terms of the slant at the top, in terms of the edges being perfectly straight. I actually want a little bit of movement. And down at the bottom here, I'm going to do a little bit of a tap with my brush, just so it looks like there's a little bit of foliage overlapping that bottom area. Now I'm going to move us in a little bit closer for the following pieces, and that way you can see the detail work. So now yet again, I'm going to mix a bit more of that pigment, take some titanium white, the smallest hint of Mars black. Looks like we got a very close match quickly there. And I'm going to make another one right down here, and this one's going to be smaller because it's farther away. But it's going to follow those same rules and it's going to get lost in this bush right here. As I continue, they're going to start to get a little bit visually closer together because of perspective. And they're going to continue to get a little bit smaller each time, until we get over to the edge here. And that is the end. Now we get to have some real fun. Take more of this, and by the way, I just wet my brush again, trying to keep it consistently damp. That way I get those really sharp, clean lines. So I'm mixing a bit more of that gray. I'm coming back, and I'm connecting them. Doing it through multiple little strokes here, that way I can course correct on the way. And then I'm making a second one right underneath, like that. Then I'll continue. And we want this to be incredibly sharp, incredibly clean. So apply as little pressure as you possibly can. If it's just paint, touching paint on canvas, that's ideal. You really don't want to have to push those bristles into the canvas. Grab a little bit more. Again, they're getting smaller and smaller, so I'm applying less and less pressure. And if they get a little bit more transparent as we move farther back, that is okay, because honestly, you don't see the detail and you don't see the values that far away. Now here we're going to get into a bit of a bigger post, so this is where it gets a little bit interesting. I'm trying to make sure that the horizontal wood posts always touch one another on either side. And this one, it kind of moves forward a bit more in the painting. So we have a bit of additional dimensioning happening. It's not just a horizontal line. I mean, it's all kind of slightly angled, but this one, the boards that are closest to us are a little bit bigger. And then as they get towards this post, they progressively get a little bit smaller and taper. I would also like to note that I've been tripping on my words a little bit more than I normally do, and I'm just getting a little bit sick. So that's all that is. I am taking lots of vitamin C, eating very healthy, but you know, occasionally this does happen. My partner's sick right now, so I do apologize if my ability to articulate is suffering a little bit, and suffered a little bit in the previous lesson. It is just being a little bit sick, a little bit out of it, finding that my hand's actually a little bit more shaky today than it normally is. And that can make things difficult, but I think it's also interesting because I get a number of messages from people who do have shaky hands, and might get the comment, I used to be able to paint so much better because of it. And that's entirely fair, but there are ways to work around it. So today and yesterday, you'll probably notice that I'm putting my hand on the canvas a lot more. I might be bracing my pinky finger on the canvas, and that's just to take out a little bit of shake. And I also have to do that when I'm feeling a little drowsy when I'm painting and I have some coffee, because occasionally it can also make me a little bit shaky. So just different ideas and tips, I suppose, when you are feeling a little bit sick, or when you do have a little bit too much coffee, or you're a little bit overtired. Consider just bracing your hand on the subjects, and that's really going to help in the process. Here again, I would like to note that the board here is larger right here than it is right there. And that's because we're getting closer to us in the foreground. I'm starting to run out of paint, and here I'm applying a very minimal amount of pressure. I'm not really getting paint on the canvas, and I don't want to press any harder. So yet again, I'm going to dampen my brush, grab some more paint. I'm almost out, so we'll mix some more. And don't worry, we will go back and make these fences a bit more three-dimensional when we're done with our base layers. These sideboards, these horizontal boards, can also get wider as a whole as you move closer towards the foreground. And you'll also probably notice that I'm not necessarily trying to make them even in between the top and bottom of this. They are slightly higher, so there's a bit of an area at the bottom here that's open, and then this board is quite close to the top of those posts. It's just a little design choice. It's something you don't have to make yourself, but I personally like it a lot that way. Now, yet again, we'll mix some more. The more you move to the left here, the more paint you need, just because the subjects themselves are getting quite large. Now we're going to start getting into a bit of a turn. You can see that this is starting to wrap a little bit. So I'm going to move this one down slightly. Going to be cautious of the tree here. Don't want this new pigment overlapping that previously applied pigment. Just flipped my brush to grab some extra paint, because there's generally some on the other side. There we go. So far, so good. Because our pigment is quite watery though, I am going to go back and do a secondary layer right here. Just thicken that a little bit. This one too. And this is just little touch-ups. Now there's probably going to be another post right here, so I'll take just a little bit of that white and black, and I'll throw just something right in between these branches. Like that. Now we need to consider the light source and how to make this look three-dimensional. Because the light's coming this way, so that means all of the sides of these posts that are facing the light are going to be bright. So the majority of them is. But these posts still have a little bit of an edge to them, so we're going to mix a darker edge color, make it look three-dimensional. Grab some Mars black, some titanium white, mix a nice darker gray. Doesn't need to be super dark, but a little bit darker. This looks quite good. I'll try to angle that so you can see it without the reflection. And now I'm going to go in between a lot of our posts and work that in. As you can see, it's quite subtle, perhaps too subtle, so I'll grab more Mars black and I'll work that in. We'll give this a try. Again, I'm bracing my hand for a little bit of extra control. I'm going to move over to this one, placing it on the left-hand side. As we get farther and farther away, these markings should get smaller and smaller. If they're accidentally larger than you want them to be, that is okay. We can go back in and just make the white gray post a little bit more white gray. But here you can see that I'm going back over all of this a couple of times, just making sure that it's a nice thick application. And then I'll grab a very minimal amount with a fairly damp brush, and I'll go over with just a tap the edge of the post on the left-hand side, because hypothetically this is going into the side and there's a little bit of side showing in front, and therefore a little bit of shadow showing in front of the connection. Just like that. See? So much more dimension. Just very, very quickly, very easily. Now, hypothetically, these are boards that are three-dimensional too, right? So they could have a top that's exposed, they could have a bottom that's exposed. It depends on the perspective, how you're looking at it. Is your sight line above or below these? And for us here, I think these are a little bit lower than general sight lines. For a child, it might not be, so it might be painted from a little bit of a different perspective. But that means that the top of these is going to be slightly exposed. Now, it could have a lot of light, it could have an equal amount of light to this, but that's risky because then you just don't see it. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to make the tops slightly brighter than what we already have. So take some of our titanium white, a little bit of our Mars black, build something nice and bright. Then I'll just tap this on the top, give it a nice little test. It didn't work poorly. If anything, I just feel like we thickened the wood application, and that looks good in the very least, but I think it does need to be brighter. So take a bit more titanium white, mix that right beside, that way we know that it is indeed brighter. We're starting with quite a bright gray, so making it even brighter is a little bit challenging, but that's okay. Looks like we did find something brighter, and it looks like it's actually working really, really well. So I'll apply that to the top of the posts too. And then as we get farther back, much like the shadow side of the post, this is going to dissipate and become less and less noticeable. Not that it's hyper noticeable up here in the foreground anyway. I think that as a whole looks really, really nice. Let me get a wide shot for you. So just like that, so much more detail in the painting, so much more dimension. It really feels like an area you could walk through at this point. But I think it's still far from done because I want a fence on this side, I want it winding back there, I want it there, and maybe a little bit here. So I think we'll get close, we'll go to that side, and we'll continue. But this next side, it's interesting because light's coming this way, which means the posts that we see here are actually on the opposite side of the light, like this side of the tree. It's the shadow side. So it can't be this same bright, almost whitish gray value. It needs to be something a bit darker. So we'll get to play with that in just a second. So here we are yet again zoomed in, and the first place I'm going to start here is right here. Why? Because I know I want one right on the bend, and it's going to be the best place to start, because if I started here and then I didn't leave enough room to get to this, it could look a little bit awkward. So we're starting there, and this needs to be a bit darker, and I'm going to make it a hint blue. So I'll take some titanium white, I'll take a little bit of Mars black. I don't want it as dark as that, but I don't want it as bright as that. I want something nice and in the middle, like that. And then I'll grab a hint of blue as well, because a lot of our shadows have this slightly cooler color in them. And now with this, I'll come to this spot. I start placing it where we want it. And I'll look at the dimensions over here, see kind of how high this is ratio-wise to the bush, and it's almost a 50-50. So you know what, I will make this just about as high as the bush is, kind of on top. Like that. And as you can see, it's darker, it blends in. I think it needs to be a bit darker though. If you look at the shadows on these, I think that's a good indication of where the value might look a little bit better. So we'll take some Mars black, we'll work that into what we had. Again, I don't want anything too dark, but we'll slowly just make it a little bit darker until we have what we really want. So we'll try this now. Just some trial and error. It's not bad. It's really not bad. Let's go a little bit darker. Of course, the more we do this, the more that paint's going to blend with the previous application. So we're not going to get anything truly dark unless we kind of overcompensate at this point, and I don't want to do that. So, you know what, I think I'll leave this one for a second, and we'll go and we'll work on another one. So I say, you know what, how far are those apart? This one might be here, I think. Yeah. That looks accurate. And we'll have it get lost in the bush in the same way those do, in the same way that one does. We're trying this slightly darker gray, seeing how it works. And again, I like it. I think it needs to be darker though. So more Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. We'll try this. Can be a little bit more thick. It's closer to us here. And then we might just get the edge of one over here, and that's extremely close, so I might go with more of a almost pure Mars black there. Now these are all quite wet, so I can't edit them much at this point. I think I'm going to let them dry for 2 or 3 minutes, kind of take a step back, assess how it's all looking, if I want to make any dramatic changes with it, and then we'll continue from there. So I took a couple minutes to kind of sit back and really think about the lighting scheme here and what value, what color these should be. These boards are essentially white boards. We paint them as light grays because they're not going to have that much light on them, but having them this dark, or dark at all really, doesn't make as much sense as I initially thought it would, because these little sidings are as dark as they are because this area is casting a direct shadow on them, where these aren't really going to have anything creating that harsh shadow. You're still going to get that reflective light from the sky and everywhere else. So this actually needs to be quite bright. Not quite as bright as this, but still quite bright. Making it this dark would make sense in a very dramatically lit scenario. Something like a sunset. When there's a sunset, there's generally a much greater wrap of light where you have something that's very bright and then very dark. Where this is something that's relatively bright and relatively dark. There isn't that harsh contrast. The only place in this painting that there's a really harsh contrast is right here, and that's just because of the direct shadow. So just a friendly reminder that lighting schemes are different. They're different in every painting, and generally when you have a lot of clouds, you're going to have a lot of light kind of bouncing around everywhere, and you're not going to have hard lighting. So in rainy scenes, in scenes that are naturally lit but a little bit darker, you're probably going to have some softer light. There are exceptions. If it's a dark piece and it's not natural light, like a car headlight creating light or a lamp, then you're probably going to have a very extreme dramatic contrast. But something like this, where all of the light in the piece is simply coming from the sky, and that which kind of bounces around the landscape, is going to be softer. You're not going to get those very harsh differences. So what we're going to do, I believe this is dry, that's good. I'm going to take that same brush, I'm going to take some titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, mix those together. I want something a bit brighter, like that. And I'm just going to go back in, find the most comfortable way of going about this, and work this on. This will make a lot more sense. If we need to darken it a little bit in a little while, we can do that. But let's start with something that's a little bit brighter, because the light might not be going in this direction, but we're going to have a lot of reflective light, and we really won't have harsh shadows. There we go. Again, I'm a little bit sick, my hand's a little bit shaky, but it's so nice and relieving to get that edge done. Feels good. There we go. Moving that paint down, getting the other edge. So far, so good. We did decide that we do one over here. It's going to be a bit larger. Not physically, but visually, because it's closer to us. Now we'll mix a bit more of that. And create some connective posts. That said, we should also, I suppose, do some in the background. So you know what, let's do that. Remember, as they get farther away, they get slightly visually closer together. Just letting the paint run out on my brush here. Making smaller and smaller posts. Like that. We should start with the ones in the background while we don't have much paint on our brush, and while we can make these very subtle small markings. can see my pigment's semi-transparent right now, which is good. That's what we want. These turns are super fun. Still trying to connect the edges of one post to the other, even when there's a bit of a curve. Starting to press a little bit harder with my brush to get a slightly larger marking. This is another post that has quite a dramatic change in space and perspective. So I'm making this area wider than I am the back, and I'll do that yet again for this next one as well. There we go. I'm going to dampen my brush to condense the bristles, grab some more paint, and then I'll go over this one again because it's closer to us. We want it to be a bit more opaque, a bit brighter. That's good. Now we'll mix a bit more. Titanium white, Mars black. And we'll connect these. Now, this is an area that I feel like a lot of people will mentally take a little break with, just because what we have to do, we need to put a post on top of our previously applied posts, which means we have to take out some of that hard work that we did, some of that detail, but that's okay. This is natural, it'll look good, it'll look natural, and that's what will make it believable, and that'll make it look like a place you want to explore. So this is a good lesson, and it's just that sometimes to make things look proper, we need to cover up other areas we like, and that's okay. That's really going to make you a better painter. It's going to allow you to make your painting significantly more complex, and we're going to do that right here. So I'm going to go to the edge where that one connects. I'm going to find that, and then I'll say, you know what, let's start. I'm going to start with a smaller stroke, and I'll expand upon it if I want it to be higher or lower. I'm glad I did that because I want it higher on this post. So now I can expand upwards a little bit. There we go. Now I don't have a lot of water on my brush right now. It's not all that damp. So as you can see, it's a little bit grainy and I'm not getting a consistent application. So I need to take my brush, add a little bit of water to it, wipe off the excess paint, come back, grab some new paint with that newly damp brush, and now I'll have a lot more control. Yeah, there it is. I already have a lot of paint here, so I'm not worried about it being thin. And even if I were, I could just go back over it. There we go. Let's make another one. I'm consistently making this darker than I should, and that's actually something I naturally do. I prefer slightly darker images, and I know in my mixes I make things slightly darker, slightly higher contrast. So that's something to consider. I've been reviewing some artwork from the patrons over at the Mighty Oak level for a while now, and that's a conversation I have with a couple of them. It's our natural preferences working their way into our work, and whether that's a good thing, whether that's a bad thing. And I think it all depends, because it gives your work a signature, your signature. It makes it look like something you've done, and that's really neat. But sometimes if you naturally paint things to be a bit darker, and you want to paint a really bright, sunny beach scene, well, then you might want to be very cognizant of what you naturally do, and either kind of double down on that, or work to remedy it and make things a bit brighter than you normally do. And this is a scenario where I'm working to make things a bit brighter than I normally do. Continue this forward. As you can see, sometimes when I apply this, I go over this board here, and I don't want that in the end, but I can always go back and just do some vertical lines to fix it up. We are getting there. Getting very close. Good. Again, starting smaller and then working my way bigger. If you let some of your brush strokes show through in this process, it actually looks quite nice as well. Just because it looks like a little bit of movement and pattern in the wood. Move this in that same way, trying to keep the spacing here and here relatively equal, even if the board expands a little bit, again, because of perspective. It's also worth noting that all of these pieces of wood are fairly pristine, right? They've been cut, they've probably been manufactured, they've been put in by a city probably, but they don't have to be that way. This could be something that looks much more natural. And to get it to look that way, all you really need to do is make these a little bit less straight, and you will quickly have something that looks a bit more organic. Like maybe someone went and actually cut these themselves, and you know, it's entirely a preference thing. Now it's important that we go back and we kind of clean up the edges. These vertical edges. Okay. Now I think I'm going to take a little look at this. I think I want this board to be a little bit larger down here at the bottom. And that's the first little fix I want to make. I feel like it might actually be wider over here, and that isn't what we want. Okay. You know, that actually worked really, really well. Good. Really, really good. I think I will take 5 or 6 steps back, look at this from afar, take 2 to 3 minutes to kind of figure out what we want to do with it, and then I will be right back. So I've taken a couple minutes to kind of assess what I wanted to do with this next, and I think at this point I'm quite happy with not having a fence post right here. I drew out a couple of different versions with Conte on the canvas, none of them really stuck, so I wiped that off, and now I think we'll go into this. We'll add in some of the extra depth that we did over here, and then we'll add a little bit of maybe raindrops down in the water. So some exciting stuff, and let's just jump back into it. Now, as we talked about, the lighting's a little bit more complicated in this piece because there's a lot of reflective lighting, and the light is bouncing around, it's bouncing off of all of these things, it's reflecting onto these, which makes the backs a little bit brighter, but we're not going to see a true shadow. We don't have anything here necessarily reflecting or kind of bouncing, kind of putting out a shadow onto something else. So we're not going to have any necessarily really dark areas there. Instead, we're going to have some true highlights on the tops of these and on the right-hand side of them. So for that, we're just going to take a good amount of titanium white, the smallest hint of Mars black that we can possibly get to make sure that this isn't a pure white. Oh my, where's my brush on? There it is. There it is. Okay, we'll do that one more time. Titanium white and a little bit of Mars black. Again, a little sick, a little out of it, but it's not going to stop us from creating a great painting here. So, I have some real highlight. Going to head to the top of this bad boy. And you know what? That really shows up. We are in luck. Wonderful when what makes sense to work actually works. Means we had it right. We figured it out. So I'm just applying this on top of the board. And I'll do this for the ones in the foreground here. Now I'm starting to run out of paint, and as that happens, it becomes more transparent and I don't get that highlight that I did at the bottom. So this is something where I'm sure we will have to continuously go back and grab more of that highlight. Here I'm bracing my hand yet again. Have it get smaller and smaller as it works its way back. And then here yet again we want that true highlight. So, titanium white, mix that there. This is great. More titanium white, slowly just grabbing little bits of gray from our previous mixture. There are little divots. That makes sense, being that it's wood. And now the right-hand side of these, as well as the top. Can have a little bit here. That might get a bit of a shadow though. So you know what, that might be your opportunity to incorporate a little bit of a shadow. We'll give it a try. We'll see how it looks. See if it works naturally. So grab a little bit of Mars black, take off the excess, move that over into our highlight, make a mid-gray. Just tap that right here. And that worked too. That's really nice. Okay, so we have highlights on the tops of our posts, on the right hand sides of our posts, but where these connect slightly in to this middle post, we add just a little bit of gray. And that worked really, really well. So now we can head back down into the water and do a little bit of a pitter-patter of rain. So here we are, right in the heart of the painting. I'm still going to stick with this smaller brush, and I'm just going to be using the corner of it because it's so nice and sharp. Now I'm going to take some titanium white, I'm going to take a very small hint of our cerulean blue, work those together, and I'll pick a little spot here that's maybe a larger open area, just so we can really see. I'm going to do a little bit of a splash. So I started with a little bit of a vertical tap, and now I'm doing some taps outwards from the bottom. Again, it's a vertical tap, and then some taps outwards from the bottom. Vertical tap, outwards from the bottom. We want these to be different shapes, different sizes. And you can have the water move out from that area. And that's just creating a little oval around that splash. And you can have a couple little ovals coming out from that area. Mine are leaning more towards the left. So I'll do almost a full oval, and then the second one will just be partial, and the majority of it will be on the left-hand side. And it's on the left-hand side simply because I'm painting with my right hand and I'm sitting to the left. So it's just a more comfortable way of applying it. See that? It's incredibly subtle. In the distance, it will just look like a little pitter-patter. So it'll tap here and there. You lose that detail, but in the foreground, you can do just a lot more with it. Here we have a lot of room. This one's nice up close. Remember, I'm just using the corner of my brush. I'm letting it be really thin. I have a lot of water on my brush right now to make it transparent, to make my strokes nice and small. There we go. Remember, in the background, it's just this really tiny little tap in the water. As little pressure as possible. You want this to be incredibly subtle. There we go. Just like that. Doesn't that look like rain? It'll look like rain significantly more from a little bit of a distance too. The farther away you get, the more natural it will look. Going back over some of these larger areas, making them slightly more opaque and noticeable. Like that. And then I'll go in and I'll do some more little taps for the rain. You can also have some hitting the ground. They won't be as noticeable, so I'm not going to do as many. But it's the same technique. Occasionally they look a little bit more vertical, which is okay. It kind of looks like a piece that is falling rather than a piece that is hitting. And it's okay to have one or two of those. But for the most part, we do want just these little circular applications. Almost gives it a little bit of magic, doesn't it? I am loving this. We can also add hints of this that are kind of hitting our roses, and I can add little bits of highlight onto them. And then little pieces that are hitting and splashing off of our bushes as well. Because if it does that on the ground, then it'll do that on foliage, right? There's a little splash. Might be a bit big. Make it a bit more transparent by just rubbing that pigment around. And you can see that I'm really jumping around here, trying to make sure that I don't do the same thing 900 times in the same area, that I am creating some diversity and that my clusters are always changing and evolving. Remember that the farther back we get, the smaller these taps need to be. Even on the bushes. Can be a bit larger up close. You can even add a little bit of water onto this foreground area by kind of connecting some of the foliage via potential dripping water and water that just kind of sits on the top of it. So I'm using a very watered down pigment here. That way it's semi-transparent. Just makes all of this foliage look like it's kind of glistening a little bit. And we can grab a little bit more. Like that. And we can have that actually just kind of working its way on the roses if you want. And I'm just doing this on the tops of the petals. We also don't have to do it to all of them. I feel like that's a bit too dramatic, so I'm going to take all of the pigment off of my brush, add a lot of water to it, and I'm just going to try to scrape that off, just like that. Subtlety is key. Here I'm going back and I'm thickening a couple of these little drops in the foreground. More so the splashes around them though. We can also have it hitting the tops of our fences and do a little bit of a tap there. I think when a lot of people initially paint rain, it's kind of everywhere. But one of the best ways to paint it is just subtly as it hits the subjects on the ground. I think we'll do a bit of a wide shot, see how this is all turning out, and then go from there. Just after another quick little round of touch-ups. There we go. So here we have a nice wide shot of all of that rain hitting and splashing, and as you can tell, the farther away you get, the more subtle it gets, the more natural it looks, and we were able to incorporate quite a bit of detail in that way, but I'm going to continue to add a little bit of splashing and hitting water down here, and I'm going to do so with the smaller round-headed brush and a technique that we normally use to create stars. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this, and I'll show you. In my water dish here, I'm going to make it very, very wet. Just wipe off a little bit of that extra water. Grab some titanium white, small hint of blue. I'm going to grab a lot more water. Mix that right here on my palette and on my brush. You can see it's turning into almost just a watercolor. I'm going to put down that, I'm going to peel back my bristles, and I'm just going to launch hundreds of little applications down here at the canvas. I'll do a much closer shot of this, but it's a great way of getting a lot of pigment on that canvas and very small applications that you wouldn't be able to render naturally anyway. It kind of tends to go everywhere. You can be slightly directional with it depending upon how close or far away you are with your brush and your ratio of water to pigment. And that's something I recommend playing with. but it's a great way of just getting really small applications that, again, you couldn't get with a tap because these are smaller than any amount of condensed bristles. Also worth noting, if you're painting with something in the background of your painting, be it a computer, a laptop, a drawing tablet, you might want to put a sheet down or a blanket or something of that sort, because you can get a little bit of white paint elsewhere and you can get a little bit of a pitter-patter effect. So watch out for that, but we'll get a little bit closer and I'll show you that technique up close. So here we are yet again. I'm currently wetting my brush, getting a little bit of that titanium white, hint of our blue, mixing those together. You can see that it still has the consistency of paint right now. So I'm grabbing more water, mix that in. Now it's starting to drip. It's just like watercolor. I might add a little bit more pigment in there just for slightly more consistency. There we go. Putting my palette down, peeling back the bristles, and just letting this come down and hit in all of these different ways. I'm going to grab more for my palette there. And just like that, so much rain working its way through the piece. Now here you can see that I did get some of that on my easel, and I'm okay with that. I'm not someone who's afraid to get paint on their easel, but it is a good reminder that the areas surrounding your painting might get a little bit of white paint on them. So I'm actually really happy with that amount. Remember, in the process you probably will get a little bit on your fence, on your surrounding areas, but that's okay because the rain doesn't just fall on the pathway, right? So now, maybe we'll, again, take a step back and perhaps do a little bit of falling rain. We could try it. It's not something that's... When you go outside and it's raining and you look forward, you generally don't actually see little dots. You don't see falling lines generally. That's something that's, I think a lot of us associate with from childhood, from watching cartoons, from watching animated features, because that's generally how it's portrayed in those mediums. But in real life, you don't generally see that. You just see a bit of a whitewash over what you're looking at. Occasionally you can see a little bit of it, and that's what we'll try to capture. I'm not saying it'll stay, but I'm kind of prefacing all of this just because, again, I think there are ways of doing it. There are ways of doing it that will make it look fine, but very, very rarely does it look natural and make sense. And we're going to try to capture something that does, and if we don't, we're going to take it out. So with that, let's proceed, but cautiously and intelligently. So here we are, we're a little bit higher on the canvas. I've switched back to my smaller flat-headed brush. I'm going to grab some of our titanium white, a little bit of our cerulean blue. My brush is quite damp, and we want it to be relatively watery, but not too watery, significantly less watery than what we just had. And then I'm going to find the angle of the rain I'd like it to be falling on. I think I want it falling like this. Maybe practice in the air a couple of times before you actually apply it. People do that a lot in figure drawing. You kind of figure out the shapes of the form and the body first before you actually apply it. It's a good habit to get into when you're just kind of starting something like this without a drawing. But I'm just going to create some very, very tiny little markings. They're going to be done here, a little bit of a diagonal look. I'm using the corner of my brush. I'm starting at the top of the stroke, and then it's progressively getting smaller, like that. Doesn't look bad. Doesn't look bad at all. I'm going to get quite a number of them on here because I kind of need to decide if this is what I want before it dries, because I can take it all off while it's still wet, but once it's dried, I need to go back and repaint the mountains. So we're acting quickly to decide if we want this. Well, I'm acting quickly. I don't recommend you starting this until you see if it's a go or it's not. Now, of course, there's a lot of water in here, so it's going to remain wet for a longer period of time, which we definitely need to test it. Okay, taking a step back, looking at it, it doesn't look all that natural. So I'm going to add a lot of water to my brush here, and I'm just going to apply some pressure over all of this. And as you can see, it's literally just turning that paint into water. I'm going to grab some more water. Again, work quickly. This is something you can always do with just about any paint application, provided it's thin and still wet. And we just start to wipe it off. So to kind of summarize what we just attempted and learned, in my eyes at least, was that style of rain could have looked relatively subtle, could have looked quite good, but I don't think it would have looked natural. And I think there's a big difference between looking good and looking natural. There are so many brilliant surreal pieces out there that don't follow natural rules. And it's not a bad thing to break those rules or to make things look unnatural in a lot of cases. However, sometimes you do want things to look just a little bit more real, a little bit more tangible. And so for that reason, I opted not to add the rain actually falling from the sky, at least visually. Instead, we'll just have this at the bottom. It's subtle. It, tells you what's happening, and it looks quite natural, again, to kind of abuse the word. But I'm very happy with the amount of rain we have here. What I would like to do next, though, is have just a couple of vines, a couple of maybe stems growing up here, some roses, maybe at the top, just something to kind of intertwine the two and put them together. So next we'll get close, we'll go back to our reds, and we'll make a couple more roses. So we're back, we're up close, we're continuing to use our smaller flat-headed brush, and like our first set of roses, I'm going to begin by taking some red here, taking a little bit of Mars Black, mixing up a nice deep dark color right there. And I'll grab a hint of titanium white to thicken that pigment, make sure it's not too dark. Now I'll find an area on here that I want my rose, and I think if we have a vine growing up here, maybe one right here. Remember, I like to make the bottom a bit more of a point, and then the top is almost like 3 strokes. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3 strokes. We'll do another one. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3 strokes. So these are pointing in 2 vastly different directions, which is kind of fun. Might throw another one down here. It's a bit smaller because it's a little bit farther away. And you know what, we might throw another one. Don't want it to be excessive. Maybe at the top here. Yeah, that looks good. That looks really good. We can also do some in the background, just not many. So that's my base layer. I'm just now using some water to take off the darker pigment from my brush. I'll grab some of my red, grab a little bit of my white, mix those all together, make a nice mid-tone, brighter than what we just created. As per usual, I'll start on the right hand side of my petals. There we go. Now we'll take a bit more titanium white, work that in, make it brighter. Work that on the right hand side. Maybe do a little bit of a middle to this one. This is going to have a bit more highlight on the top. Have the petals wrap around this one, maybe this one too. And then we'll go for one final highlight of just titanium white and our red, minus the Mars black. That way it's a little bit more pink and a little bit more saturated. Here I'm just going in, adding those details. Looks good so far. Really, really nice. Of course, sometimes we add a little bit too much of a highlight though. So in that case, we'll grab a little more red, maybe a hint more black. There we go. You can see the color well there. Use the corner of our brush to work in that detail again. And that's nice and subtle. Now I think we'll get even closer for the vine portion. Now we'll continue with that smaller brush. As you can see, there's a little bit of red on it. So I'm just going to clean it in a little bit of water, wipe off the excess on a paper towel. Then I'll take some of my sap green, a little bit of our Mars black, hint of our titanium white. Makes a nice dark base color. Start tapping on a really thin, small vine here. Can wrap it around the post a couple of times. Have that one connect. This one can kind of connect back down that way. Now I have a lot of water and I pressed a little bit too hard so it made a larger impression there, but I was able to just wipe it off because there was so much water. So I'll grab more pigment again and I'll try again. And that's a much smaller marking, as is that, and those are what I'm looking for. So now that leads down in, that one's a little bit wider, so again I'm wiping it off. And if you find it's continuously too watery, just go ahead and mix some additional paint. Eventually the paint to water ratio will be to your liking. Much better. Okay, and we'll continue that through here. It's a really nice little vine right there. There you can see it's really wrapping its way around in a couple of ways. And you know what, I think we'll continue it over here as well. Just because it's a really nice, natural, pretty thing to incorporate. And we need that in the background. And I might throw this on a poster too back there as well. You can also break off and create secondary vines, like that. And then, just wiping off the excess paint on my brush, I mix up a bit of a lighter version. So more titanium white, more green. Work that into the initial, that way they're relatively similar. And you can even tap on a little bit of highlight to the tops of them. Build a little dimension on there. It's going to be incredibly subtle though. You don't want to make your vines larger in this process. Much better. Really, really nice. That said, you know what? I think I might want that to be a little more angular. If you don't like how your vines are working in one area or another, just take some titanium white, hint of Mars black, a little bit more white, and paint over it. This is also a way to thin your vines if you feel like they've gotten too thick. I'm just moving this into the other areas, that way this area looks consistent with the rest if the value's slightly different. But I think I like the idea that this rose is actually behind the fence. So we have one behind, one in front, creates a bit more depth, and it simplifies that area a little bit, which I do like. So that is a success. Now we talked a lot about how we changed the fence to work better with all of the reflective light, and I'd like to kind of take that idea into this tree right here, because right now it has a relatively dark backing, but if the light is really relatively reflective, there might be a little bit of light wrapping its way around the left-hand side, and then this area right here would be the darkest. So I am just going to take a little bit of burnt umber here, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, make up a slightly dark brown, that's also relatively gray, and I'll tap that along these edges, just to give it slightly more light. But not much. This is a very subtle thing. And then I might work it in just a hint. But that's all I really wanted to do there. If you felt like the contrast is super high in these, I might go back and just add a little bit of a highlight to the left-hand side. Again, just incredibly small, the most minute amount possible. But I do feel like the values here are relatively soft, and I don't feel like it's needed here. So with that, let's take a wide shot, see how it's looking, and I think we might be done, but we'll see. We'll take a couple of steps back, we'll really think about it, and then we'll proceed if necessary, and if not, I'm really, really happy with this. So I took a couple of minutes, I took a couple of steps back, and the conclusion I came to at the end of that was simply that I'm very happy with this painting as it currently stands. And so I am going to call this the conclusion of this one. I feel like we balanced the organic, the man-made, and the natural really, really well. I like the balance of subtle reds with all of the greens. I think that just as a whole, we were very, very successful. And it's always really nice, especially when you do it when sick. So with that, I have a couple of ideas that I personally feel like they might overcomplicate it a little bit, but I figured I'd pass them on to you just in case you wanted to give them a try. One would be adding another tree right here, right before, rather after, as opposed to this fence post. So here's the fence post, I move it right there, and I put it up. Again, might overcomplicate it, but it's an idea if you feel like yours could use something else. Another idea is continuing this fence this way a little bit. Again, I thought about it. I don't want to cover up this or this. And I know earlier when we were working right here, we talked about, oh, sometimes you have to cover up the work you're really happy and proud of. But it is, it's a balance thing. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. You kind of weigh the pros and cons. And I feel like I prefer it like this, but some of you may prefer it kind of continued. Another suggestion is having a person, maybe a little umbrella. That's always a fun idea. So those are 3 different ideas you could continue with if you'd like to, but again, I'm very happy with my version like this. I'm going to keep my version like this, and we haven't done a rainy day piece in quite some time, so I'm happy that we were as successful as we were with this one. I will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson. Sick or not, we'll make it happen, and I really look forward to that. So thank you so much. If you are a member on Patreon at the Alpine tier or above, please feel free to post your piece up over onto the private Facebook group. Love to see that. That's always a lot of fun. Have a little conversation. But with that, thank you so much. I will see you soon, and above all, as always, stay creative.